Morning, everybody. Good to see y'all. Thank you so much. Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for being here, for hanging out with us. My name's Scott. I'm one of the pastors here and just want to welcome you. Whether you're here with us on campus or if you're with us online, we're glad you're here. We are continuing this series we've been in for a while, and we got a few more weeks left in it, that we're making our way through the book of Romans. Romans is a book in the New Testament. It's actually a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Rome. And in some ways, Paul wrote a bunch of letters that we have in the New Testament. In a lot of ways, Romans is considered like his masterpiece letter. Because what Paul does is in the first part of Romans, he kind of gives his best explanation, his most thorough explanation of Christian faith. What it's all about, what it's rooted in, what it means. And it's all based on this word that you hear kind of a lot if you've been around churches, but it's the word gospel. That for Paul, everything about Christianity is rooted in what he calls the gospel. And gospel is a Greek word that means good news. But when Paul uses it and when the early church uses it, they're not just referring to any good news. Actually, originally, gospel was a military term. You would give good news of a military victory. But when Paul and the early church use it, they use it to refer to the good news of what God is doing through Jesus. That Jesus is the means by which God is saving and restoring creation. Paul was a good first century Jew. Christianity began within the Jewish movement. And so if you look at like the Jewish hope of the first century world that Paul lives in, there was this hope from Jewish people that at some point God would break into history and he would reclaim his creation and he would reestablish himself as king. That was kind of the Jewish hope. And that if you go back to the beginning of Genesis, the first part of the Bible, that God created the world and it all kind of fell apart and there was rebellion. But when you get to the first century, this is what Jewish people are hoping for, that God would break back in and save and restore his creation and establish himself as sovereign over all of it. And so the early Christians believed that God had done this through Jesus. That's what Jesus was all about. That's what Jesus' death and his resurrection were all about. That was the gospel. That was the good news. That God had broken into the world and through Jesus was saving and bringing creation back to himself and reestablishing himself as the ruler over all creation. So if you were here when we kicked off this series, I shared this definition, but I want to share it again. Here's how kind of we're defining the word gospel. The good news that God's reign began in Jesus. When Paul uses it, this is kind of this is what he means. That the good news, the gospel is that in Jesus, God is saving and reclaiming and reestablishing himself as king over all creation. And so for the first part of Romans, that's what it's all about. Paul's saying, hey, Here's what happened in Jesus. Here's what his death and resurrection is all about. Here is the gospel. Now, when you get to the second half, Paul's going to begin to say, okay, if this is true, if the gospel is true, then how should we live? Because if God really is king, then we should probably live differently. And so we've made our way, and if you weren't here for part of it, you can go back online, you can watch the first part, and it's great stuff. I love the first part of Romans. But really the heart of Romans, I believe, is the second part. It's when Paul's now going to unpack, here's how we live in response to this. Here's what it looks like to live with Jesus as king. And today we're going to start in Romans 12. We're going to look at Romans 12. And really this is the shortest section we're going to focus on. Like last week, if you were here last week, we covered like 3 chapters of the book of Romans. And a lot of times we'll cover like a whole chapter and a half. Today we're literally going to look at 2 verses. Because I believe that really this is kind of the heart of the letter. That Paul's going to begin to explain to us, here's what it looks like to actually live the gospel. Because the gospel isn't just something you believe or accept, it's something that you live. Because if God really is king, then we should live that way. And so here's what Paul says, Romans 12:1. He says, therefore, because of the gospel, because of what God is doing through Jesus, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Now, one of the things that made Christianity so peculiar in the first century world is it lacked most of the things that a traditional religion had. And what I mean by that is in the first century world, if you had a religion, doesn't matter what religion it was, whether it was a pagan religion or some other kind of religion, there was a few things that every religion had. One was it had a temple, a location, a place that you went, a holy, sacred place. Doesn't mean you couldn't do religious things somewhere else, but there was like a central shrine. So there was a temple. There was also a formal priesthood. And by priesthood, I'm not just referring to leadership. A priest is someone who like goes between you and God, like an intermediary. And so they would have a temple, they would have a priesthood, and they would have a formal sacrificial system. And usually the priest would do the sacrifice because there was something wrong with your relationship with the gods or the goddess or whoever it was. And so you would need this priest to guide you through the sacrifice, usually at the temple, so that you could be made right with God so that everything would be good. Now, what's interesting about Christianity is in the first century Roman world in which Christianity emerges, they use all the same religious language. They'll talk about sacrifices and they'll talk about temples and they'll talk about priests, but they don't have any of the physical structures. They actually don't have a temple. They don't have a sacred place. They meet in homes all over the place. They don't have a formal priesthood. They have leadership. There's some structure and there's some organization to it, but there's no priest that you're a go-between. And there is no sacrificial system. There's the argument that, God, in Jesus was our sacrifice, but there is no sacrificial system. So it's kind of confusing for people in the Roman world because they're looking at this saying, well, it kind of seems like a religion. They talk like a religion, but they don't have all the stuff. Now, again, Christianity uses all that religious language. For example, the New Testament talks about priests, but the language the New Testament uses is actually this phrase, the priesthood of all believers, that we're all priests. That you don't need anyone to go between you and God, that because of what God has done in Jesus, you and I have direct access to God. So you know who the priests are? All of us. And as far as the temple, what Paul will say is, you know where the temple is? The temple is the place where heaven meets earth. The temple is the place where you go to meet with God. Paul says, you know what the temple is? Your body is a temple. You place your life into Jesus. His presence, his spirit lives in you. Therefore, your body is where heaven meets earth. And what's interesting is here is when Paul, he uses this, he talks about sacrifices. But what he's talking about isn't like an animal sacrifice. It's our actions. This is what Paul says. Paul says, because you are a temple, your body, your flesh and blood is a temple, and you are a priest. The way that you offer sacrifices to God is by what you do. Everything that you are, everything that you have, all your talents, all your energies, all your resources, all of that. That Paul's making very clear that worship, see, here's the thing. Sacrifice, we're talking about sacrifice. Sacrifice in the ancient world is taking flesh and blood, someone else's flesh and blood, or typically something else's flesh and blood, some other animal, and you're giving it to that God, you're burning it, you're sacrificing it to that God for your behalf. Paul says that's not how it works. Not within Christian faith. Within Christian faith, the sacrifice that we give to God is flesh and blood, but it is our flesh and blood. I'm not giving something else's flesh and blood on my behalf. I am giving God my flesh and blood, and notice what he says, as a living sacrifice. See, a living sacrifice is much harder than a dead sacrifice. Why? Because a dead sacrifice is one and done. You take an animal, you sacrifice it, boom, it's over, it's finished. But a living sacrifice is continual. You do it every single day. See, Jesus talked to his followers. He said, if you want to be my follower, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And for Jesus, that was a daily thing. And this is what Paul's reiterating. He says, because of what God has done in Jesus, because of the gospel, here's our response, that we are all priests. Our bodies are temples. And so the way that we sacrifice is through ourselves. And Paul's using this language that is materialistic. It is about flesh and blood. It is about the words that we say and the things that we do and everything and who we are. This is what sacrifice looks like within Christianity. This is what it's all about. This is our, and notice the word Paul used at the end. He says, this is our true and proper worship. Worship is another religious term. And we typically define worship as singing. You know, a lot of times when you come to church, like, hey, stand because we're going to worship, or we're going to begin in worship. This particular word that Paul uses for worship actually means service. So worship, yes, singing is a part of worship, but worship is what you give back to God for what he has done for you. That's what worship is. In Isaiah, which Isaiah is a book in the Old Testament, Isaiah is a prophet. And the first part of Isaiah is absolutely brutal because Isaiah is talking to the people of Israel. And what he tells them is he says, listen, you all gather together and you all worship together and you celebrate the right holidays and you gather in the temple together. But literally he refers to their gathering as a trampling of God's courts. And he tells the people, he said, God doesn't want you to gather. God doesn't want you to sing. God doesn't want you to celebrate all these holidays. And you know why? Because you don't care about anybody. You don't love anybody. You oppress people. You cheat people. You lie. You rob. You steal. You're a bunch of jerks. get your stuff together. And essentially what Isaiah says, he goes, listen, your lifestyle actually invalidates your singing. That it is worthless if the two don't go together. And so when you talk about worship, yes, singing is an aspect of worship, but what Paul makes clear here is worship just isn't a thing that we do. Worship is a lifestyle in which we live, in which we are continually, every day, offering our bodies, our physical selves. Again, this is like tangible. A lot of times when we read the Bible, we think, oh, it's like spiritual or ethereal. No, Paul's using like physical flesh and blood language. The way that we respond to God for what he has done in Jesus is we offer our physical selves every day, the things that we do, who we are, what we have, we continually give that back to him. That is our sacrifice. That is our worship. Now, Paul knows that what he's asking the church in Rome to do, and really ultimately what he's asking us to do, this whole idea of being a living sacrifice, Paul knows it's really difficult. And Paul knows it's really hard, not just because living a lifestyle of service, understanding that, Christian faith is not about what I get, it's about what I give away. Again, when you think about the fact that the founder of Christianity is Jesus, and what defines Jesus, he gave his life away for the benefit of other people. Well, of course, that's what it means to be a Christian. So Paul knows that in and of itself is hard enough. It's hard enough just to live that lifestyle. But Paul also knows that lifestyle goes completely against the culture in which the Romans live. That again, he's writing to a church in the city of Rome, the heart of the most powerful empire the world has ever seen at this point. And everything about Roman culture goes against that. And so he goes on in verse 2, and here's what he says in verse 2. He says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so now Paul warns him. He says, listen, you live in Rome. And Roman life, first century Roman life, has a way of thinking. It has a way of being. It has a value structure. It has beliefs. The word we would use is we would use culture. That Rome has a culture. And sometimes we underestimate the power of culture to actually shape us. Every group of people has a culture, no matter how big or small. Your family has a culture, where you work has a culture, your neighborhood has a culture, the city, the state, our country, it has a culture. And a culture really begins with values or beliefs. That's like the foundational level of any culture. And sometimes those values and beliefs are chosen specifically. Like sometimes families or organizations or nations, when they're founding, they'll sit down and they'll say, here's what our values are. Here's what our beliefs are. Sometimes, though, even if you don't choose them consciously, you'll choose them subconsciously. That a lot of times within families, we don't necessarily choose what our values are, like consciously, but we have them. You could look at your family and say, you know what, here's what my family values. My family values this and this and that. And so what happens in culture is we have these underlying values. And these values direct behaviors. And the behaviors then form us into certain kinds of people. That's how culture works. There's values at the bottom level. Values drive behaviors. Behaviors form us into certain people. Now, the word Paul uses for that is he says pattern. This is the pattern, that Rome has a pattern. And Rome, the thing about Rome, like when you look at Rome, in a lot of ways, ancient Rome, it was a technologically advanced place. It was an advanced society. There's some amazing things about the Roman Empire. It was also incredibly brutal and violent and prejudiced and oppressive. And so Paul's writing to the church in Rome, and he's saying, listen, you need to be careful because you live in the heart of this empire. And within this empire, there is a culture. There is a pattern. And that pattern is trying to form you into a specific person. Because this is what happens. We choose the culture. We form the culture as people. And then the culture forms us. I've talked about this before, but my first job, I got it when I was in high school, was I worked at Blockbuster Video. And yeah, amen, right there. For those of you who maybe don't know what Blockbuster Video is, before you could stream movies, if you wanted to watch a movie that you didn't own, you went to a video store and you rented. When I was there, it was DVDs. We really didn't have VHS. But you'd rent the DVD. Back before that, when I was a kid, you'd get VHS. You'd bring it home. You'd watch it. And then you'd return it to the store. And so that was my first job. And it was actually kind of a fun job. I liked movies. I enjoyed movies. So at least when you went there and you would talk to people, you would talk to customers, you were talking about movies. So as much as if you've ever worked a customer service job, it's like the worst thing ever because you're just dealing with people that are always angry and upset at you and yell at you all the time. It was still a fun job. The people I worked with were cool. But here's what I remember about Blockbuster more than anything else, is when you worked at Blockbuster, like when it came to them hiring you, they didn't hire you based on your skills. It was kind of, we can teach you how to do that. Okay, they didn't hire you based on any of that. What they hired you on is literally, were you friendly and could you smile? If you sat down in an interview with the manager and you were interviewing, if you just had a smile like, yeah. Do you know how to work a point of sale system? No, not at all. Do you know anything about movies? No, not at all. Do you work well with people? No. Do you like people? No. Great, you're hired. Like that was the whole thing. And so that's what they told us over and over again is just smile. No matter what someone says, we never use the language, the customer's always right. That's language you hear, and like the customer's always right. Because at least Blockbuster was smart enough to know, and if you've ever worked in customer service, you know this. No, actually the customers are wrong more than they're right. But even if they're wrong, if you can be friendly and smile, everything will be okay. So that's literally the one thing they kept. Now, they taught us how to use the point of sale system, and they taught us all the basic skills we would need, how to work a cash register. But all they kept beating into our heads is, you just smile. No matter what someone says, you smile. So people come in, and that's what you would just smile. Even if they railed on you, even if they were like, the Blockbuster video sucks. Yes, we do. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Your prices are too high. Yes, they are. Your uniforms are dumb. Absolutely, ma'am. They 100% are. Yeah, I hate you and I hate your life. Yes, thank you very much. Have a great day. Like that's what you did. Now here's the crazy thing. Like I only worked there for a few months, but that was so ingrained that now over 20 years later, I literally do the exact same thing. It's just people will come up, and it doesn't, people come up and they'll like bag on the church or they'll bag on me, and I just smile. Hey, your sermon sucked today? Yes, I do. Yeah, absolutely. Your church is terrible? Yes, I do. We're the worst church in town. Yeah. This sucks or that sucks? Yes, I do. Thank you very much. Have a great day. And literally, like if you know me, it's not like I'm the super like chipper, optimistic person. That's just ingrained in me from working a Blockbuster video because that was the culture. The culture was all about you just smile. All you do is, that was what was beat into us. And so now, over 20 years later, that's still a part of me. Even from like just the 4 months I worked there. That's still a part of me. See, that's the power of culture. When you are a part of a culture, that it has its values and its beliefs, and this is what we need to do. We just need to be friendly. And so those values drive the behavior. Those behaviors then form you as a certain kind of person in the world. Scott McKnight talks about this. He teaches at Northern Seminary. He's a great New Testament scholar, but he wrote a book called A Church Called Tov, and he talks about the power of culture. And that's what he says. He says, listen, as human beings, either consciously or subconsciously, we shape a culture, and then that culture shapes us. And so every culture that you are a part of, your family culture, your work culture, the culture we live in this area, this part of the world, even our national culture, it is trying to form us into a certain kind of person. Now, when we think about our current culture, when we look around at the culture in which we live, really I'm kind of looking big picture in terms of the United States. When we look at kind of the main culture, popular culture in the United States, most of us would agree that what defines that culture right now is division. That there's division, and most of it has to do with political division, and don't worry, we talked a lot about that last week, we're not going to go there again, but here's why I bring it up, because here's the interesting factor. Paul talks about, he uses language, he says, there is a pattern. There is a pattern in the Roman world, a culture that's trying to form you. Here's what's so fascinating to me about the culture that we live in, is we live in this culture that is incredibly divided. And again, we use kind of political terms to talk about it, whether it's Republican or Democrat or conservative or progressive or whatever. But I think what we miss is that both sides of that foundation are actually built on the same pattern. It's like the same foundational pattern that guides both sides to just end up in radically different places. And so as much as Paul's warning the Romans, like, hey, be careful of the pattern because the pattern of your culture is trying to form you into something, it's the same thing for us, and it's the same thing no matter which side of the divide you're on. Now, I've talked about this a lot, and maybe you've read or anything about this, but we as a culture, what's known as like the Western world, right? Now bigger than the U.S., the Western world, we are moving more and more into what's being labeled as a post-Christian society. And a post-Christian society is a society that used to be dominantly Christian, and now it is not. And so when you look at statistics, Christianity is now not the dominant belief system in our culture. At one point it was. And sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that a post-Christian society is the same as a pre-Christian society. In the Western world, to understand like pre-Christian society, which is a society that was not Christian and then became Christian, in the Western world, you have to go back to the early Roman Empire. That was where like pre-Christianity existed, because then when you get into the 300s, this is where really over that century, Christianity becomes legalized. Then it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire and the Western world, really up until recently. And so in a pre-Christian society, there is no, like, again, in Rome, there was like pagan religions and all these different gods and goddesses, but there was nothing, there was no Christian values, none of that. The difference between a post-Christian society and a pre-Christian society is that in a post-Christian society, our society is actually trying to hold on to all the good things that Christianity gave society without holding on to the foundation of Jesus Christ. Because again, you look at pre-Christian Rome. What defined pre-Christian Rome? Violence and brutality and all this horrible stuff. When you look at Western culture, where did things like charity come from? Where did things like mercy come from? Where did things like care for the poor come from? Caring for widows and orphans. Who brought all of that into Western culture? Christianity. None of that mattered. None of it mattered until Christianity became kind of the dominant. And so a lot of these values that undergird our society, they came from Christianity. And so as we move into a post-Christian society, we want to hold on to these things because we don't want to let go of charity. We don't want to let go of love and service and compassion and all that stuff. But we want to let go of Jesus. So post-Christian society is let's hold on to the best things about Christianity, the things that we like that have shaped our society over the last several centuries, but let's let go of the exclusive claims of Christ. Let's get rid of that and hold on to what's best. The problem is what holds all of that stuff together is Jesus Christ. What gives all of that stuff like significance and binds it all together is the person of Jesus and his death and his resurrection and what it means and what he's doing. So when you take Christ away from that framework, the question is, what's left as the authority? Because in like Christendom is the way you would talk about like when Western society was like governed completely by Christianity. There was Christendom. And there was some good things about Christendom. There was a lot of really bad things about Christendom. But again, kind of what held that all together was Jesus. Well, now when you take Jesus out, what's the authority? What do you appeal to? See, in a Christian setting, what do we appeal to? We appeal to Jesus. Why do we do this? Because of Jesus. Why do we serve and love one another? Because of Jesus. Why do we sacrifice? Because of Jesus. Why do we give generously? Because of Jesus. He's the foundation. When you pull the foundation, what's left? What becomes the center of meaning and significance and authority? Mark Sayers, he's an Australian pastor, he's a brilliant guy. What Mark Sayers points out is the only authority left in a post-Christian world is the individual. When you take Christ out of it, there has to still be what's the ultimate authority? What's the foundation? What guides the choices that we make? And in a post-Christian society, the only answer is you and me. And so when you talk about, to use Paul's language, when you talk about the pattern of the culture that we live in, the pattern of the culture that we live in is individualism. And I would even go further and say it's radical individualism. Is what the culture that we live in, what it's all based on, the foundation, the underlying principle, the value, the belief that guides the behaviors that's trying to form us into certain kinds of people is rooted in radical individualism. You do you. You discover your truth. You find out what's right for you. And so we, in our culture, we want to do whatever it is we want to do. But the reason I use radical individualism is because it's not just I want to do whatever I want to do. I want to do whatever I want to do, and I don't want to feel bad about it. I don't want you to disagree with me. I don't want you to make me feel uncomfortable. Not only do I want the freedom to be able to do what it is that I want to do, but I want the buffering space around that to not even question it or not feel bad about it. And again, it's crazy because when you think about it, it plays on both sides. Whether you look at like more progressive ideas around abortion or gender identity, or you look at more like conservative ideals around the response to critical race theory or COVID, it's all rooted in like, don't tell me what to do. Don't make me feel bad. I am my own person. I make my own choices. I can do what I want. And don't pressure me. Don't make even there's all these statistics that people in our culture, they don't like religion, but they like spirituality. But you know what's funny? How do we define spirituality in our culture? See, typically spirituality is some kind of engagement with the transcendent, but in our culture, spirituality, I would argue, is most often defined as anything we do that transcends barriers. If there's any kind of internal barrier in my life, or even a label, if there's a label that's been put on me, and somehow internally I transcend that label, that's like this spiritual experience, that it's me breaking the limits. It's me pushing beyond what other people have put on me. And so we like this idea of spirituality because it helps me to break free from all these things that we see as in some way repressive. And some of them are. I'm not saying some of them are, but some of them are. And so the guiding pattern, the culture in which we live, is radical individualism. And so radical individualism, when that's your foundational belief, right, that guides you to certain behaviors, to do things. In our case, don't let anyone tell you what to do. You do your own thing. No one controls you. It's all about you. It's all about you. Do what's right for you. Do what's right for you. That then, those behaviors that we engage in because of those beliefs form us into certain kinds of people. Now, that operating system, if you want to call it that, of like radical individualism, it's not like that's a brand new thing. In fact, if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God creates the world, and the first story really that exists in the Bible apart from creation is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And Adam and Eve are placed there, and they're given kind of free reign and told not to do just one thing, not to eat from this one tree. They end up eating from this one tree, and the reason why is because they want to be like God. That's their temptation. We don't want to be below God. We want to be like God. They eat from that tree, and everything falls apart. So literally, like that's the original temptation, is to not be, like there's something wrong with being just a human that's underneath God. We don't want to be that. We want to be more. We want to be our own gods. We don't want God to be the center of meaning and significance in our lives. I want to be the center of meaning and significance in my life. It's all about me. And so that, again, that operating system has been around since the beginning of time. If you look in the first century world that Paul lives in and that Paul writes in and everything, that operating system was around everywhere, and specifically it pops up over and over again within the story of early Christianity. The name that's given to that way of thinking and being that's rooted in radical individualism is often called Gnosticism. You may have heard it before. There's these people that are called Gnostics, and if you ever study church history, Gnostics keep showing up over and over again in church history. And the reason why they keep showing up is because when the Gnostics talk, it sounds an awful lot like Christianity. An awful lot like it. Because when the Gnostics come along, what they keep saying is you are, more than just you're made in the image of God, is you partly are God, that there's a piece of God that lives in you, and the way you experience fullness is you transcend the boundaries and barriers of your life, and you, through your own effort, you can achieve more, and you can become more. And again, they use like Christian language, and it sounds super Christian. But it's actually the polar opposite of it. Because Christianity is rooted in what God has done for me. And so going back to Paul, because of what God has done for me, I offer my body as a living sacrifice to him. Whereas Gnosticism says, no, but here is what I do. Because it's all about me, and I'm the center of it. And so in a lot of ways, what we experience is kind of a modern rebirth of Gnosticism. And this is the pattern of the world in which you and I live. That's what they wanted. And what Paul is warning is he's saying, listen, don't just blindly give in to the culture around you. I know in a lot of ways I think Paul would say, it sounds like it makes sense. It even sounds very Christian at times, but it's not. Because unless it's rooted in the person of Jesus and what it is that God has done and is doing through Jesus, Paul would say it's not Christian. It's something else. It's different. Now, what we're witnessing in our culture, I believe, is the death of radical individualism. Because here's the deal, it's not working. That's the reason our culture is divided. That's the reason we're ticked at each other. That's the reason we hate each other. That's the reason everything's falling apart. Because when you're the center, and you're the center, and you're the center, and I'm the center, and I'm the center, and you're the center, and you're the center, we just end up fighting and hating each other. And, if you all would just get it together and realize that I'm the center of everything and just act that way, we'd be perfect. But you all won't do that. And so we end up tearing each other apart. It's like a self-destruct. And this is what Paul's warning the church in Rome about. He's saying, listen, don't let the pattern of the Roman way of life, and what he would say to us is, don't let the pattern of the dominant American way of life, don't let it form you into being a kind of person that's just going to be destructive. Don't let it form you into living a kind of life that's literally going to destroy you and to destroy your family and to destroy your society and destroy your culture. This is what Paul's getting at. This is what, and now listen, what Paul's saying here, because he goes on and he says, don't conform, but be transformed. That's his solution to it. Paul says, you know how you don't be conformed to the pattern of the world around you? You allow yourself to be transformed. Now that word transformed may not sound revolutionary to us, but in the first century world, the ancient world that Paul lives in, it's incredibly revolutionary. Because you had ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And there's other ones too, but when you read ancient Greek philosophers, they talked a lot about ethics and character and the way that you live. And they talked about like mastering your desires, some of them did. Some of them talked about just giving in to your natural desires. And so they had all these different ways of trying to figure out, here's how you live an ethical, good life. But from what we can tell, there's no one in the ancient world that was arguing for completely redoing who you are from the inside out. Which, make no mistake about it, is what Paul's saying here. Paul's saying the way that you don't conform to the pattern of the world and the culture around you is you allow yourself to be completely remade in the deepest level of who you are. This word, the whole idea for renewing here, this Greek word only shows up in Christian literature from this time. The whole idea of renewal, which is about being remade in the deepest core of your being, that's a Christian idea. So when Paul says it, this is like a radical way of thinking. Paul's saying, listen, the way you don't conform to the pattern around you is you be transformed. And Paul talks about how you experience transformation all over Romans, but he says it more concisely in 2 Corinthians 3. And here's what he says. It says, we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is Spirit. So Paul says, first of all, you want to know what transformation looks like? Transformation looks like Jesus. And Paul says the way transformation happens is through the Spirit. But again, when you place your life into Jesus, when you are baptized, he places his Spirit, which is his presence, into you, and it is the Spirit who transforms us. See, Christianity at its core is about transformation. And that happens through the power of God's Spirit. And so what Paul talks about, what Jesus talks about, is how do we as people live in the presence of the Spirit? See, if you've ever been to church, a lot of times you go to church and people talk about things like you need to pray and you need to read your Bible and you need to give and you need to do this. But they don't really say the motivation for why you do those things. And sometimes people go to church because we want to change. We come to church because we're like, you know what? My marriage is falling apart or my life's falling apart. I need to get my life together. And so we want to do things like, if I do this, I'll change. If you engage in any Christian practices and any Christian disciplines for the purpose of changing, you have the wrong motivation. And it probably is not going to work. The reason we engage in practices and disciplines, we do a thing here called rooted, and in rooted we refer to them as rhythms. They're rhythms in which we live our life. And they include all those things like reading the Bible and praying and generosity and service. The reason we engage in those rhythms is to walk in step with the Spirit, to stay in step with the Spirit. It is then the Spirit who transforms us to look more like Jesus. If you want to experience transformation, transformation comes by connecting to Jesus through his Spirit, who then transforms us. Paul says, this is how you don't conform to the pattern. you live your life connected. You live your life with rhythms that allow you to keep in step, in sync with the Spirit that lives inside of you, because you, physical flesh and blood, are a temple and a priest in which God's presence lives because you placed your life into him. And so you focus on connecting with that deepest part of you, and that Spirit will reorder and renew your life from the ground up and make you into a whole different person. And Paul says, and if you do that, if you experience that transformation, go back to Romans 12:2. He says, if you do not conform, but if you're transformed by the renewing of your mind, here's what happens. Then you will be able to test and approve of what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. See, Paul says, once you experience transformation, then you will be able to order your life under God and who God is and where God is leading you and what it is that God wants for you. Not beforehand. You can't order your life under God until you have allowed God to transform and renew and remake you. See, this is one of the big problems. And right now I want to talk to those of us who, like, you would say you're a Christian. Like, you'd say you're a Christian, you're part of a church. One of the mistakes that we make is before we allow people to come into a church, we want them to change. There's something about somebody that we don't like. We say, hey, we want you to come to church, but first you need to clean this up. Or even maybe some of you, maybe you're hesitant to come to church because you're like, well, I have this thing about me that people at church aren't going to like, aren't going to accept, so I got to clean that up. No. The whole point of Christian faith is God meets us exactly where we're at. We live our life in rhythms to stay in connection with him, and then he transforms us. I remember when I was doing my internship, when I was in college, I was working for this pastor. His name is Doug, and he's still to this day one of my mentors. And he would take me around different places, and we'd talk to other people. And I remember one of the conversations we'd have with pastors, it was kind of a big deal for pastors, it still kind of is you would get pastors that would talk about weddings they would perform and weddings they wouldn't perform. And usually you'd have kind of these older pastors that would say, well, you know what? I would never perform a wedding for people who are currently living together and sleeping together. Because the phrase they would use is they would say, they're living in sin. And if you want me to marry you, they wouldn't use these words, understand, I'm being a little sarcastic here. They would basically, the attitude of it was, if you want me to marry you, you need to stop living in sin. And then I'll marry you because I am a holy pastor who only does holy things. But my boss didn't have that mentality. He would marry people if they were living together and sleeping together. And there was some of these old pastors that would like get on him and they'd be like, how could you do this? This is an abomination before God. And this. And I loved his response, his reasoning. Because his reasoning is he would say, well, listen, you're telling me that the reason they're living in sin is because they're living together and they're sleeping together and they're not married. That's why it's sinful, right? Yes, that's why it's sinful. So if I marry them, then they're married and living together and sleeping together, and it's not a sin, right? So you're telling me I can actually marry someone out of sin. Why would I not do that? And they just kind of look at him like, well, and they'd get all frustrated. But it's what I love about my boss. My boss understood that, you know what? Wherever we're at, even if someone else would look at your life and label it as, oh, you're sinful, wherever you're at, God meets us where we're at. And then it's through his Spirit that he transforms us. See, I think one of the things we miss, and this is one of the things Paul wants us to see, is that in Christian faith, you can belong before you believe. Because transformation happens not before, but after. Transformation happens as a result of living within the church and living more specifically with Jesus Christ and the power of his Spirit that lives in me. That's where transformation happens. And so if you're sitting out there right now and you're thinking, man, my life's a mess, I don't know if I'm good. You start where you are. God meets you where you are. Jesus loves you where you are. Now, he doesn't want to leave you there, which I'm grateful for, because I would not want God to even leave me where I'm at right now. I want to experience ongoing growth and transformation. But God meets us where we are. And for those of us that are a part of the church, don't ever make someone feel like they need to clean something up before they come. Because that's just not true. If that's your belief, you're fundamentally misunderstanding Christian faith. Christian faith is about allowing God to meet you where you're at. And then through his Spirit, letting him transform you so that we're not conforming to the pattern of the world around us, but we're becoming who God created all of us to be. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you for everything you've given to us. I thank you that you came down to this earth and you died and you rose again to save and restore and renew all of creation. And God, I thank you that you are making all of us new, that you're renewing us. And Father, maybe there's some of us here today, maybe there's some of us watching online today that we've never placed our life into you. We've never began that kind of journey with you of seeking you and of experiencing your transformation. And God, that may be because this is our first time at church, or God, maybe we've been in church for 50 years and we've just never done that. But God, I pray that maybe today would be the day that we would start. That we would realize that fullness in life and renewal and growth and transformation, it's not going to happen just because we keep trying. It's going to happen because we choose to offer ourselves to you as a living flesh and blood sacrifice. And through that, we allow your Spirit to transform us into who we were always created to be. God, we love you. We thank you. We pray all of this in Jesus' name.